let me introduce Brett Atwood, who is a professor at Washington State University in Everett, Washington. And Brett is a metaverse marketing and virtual entertainment economy expert. He has more than 2 decades of executive level experience in marketing, editorial, and content strategy, including at Amazon, Linden Research, Real Networks, and Billboard Magazine. He's also been interviewed for many national news outlets, including MSNBC, CNN, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. And at WSU, Washington State University, he teaches courses in digital content production, reporting, and social media persuasion. We've got the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea, Mike, and thank you to the PRSA. I'm glad to see everybody here. And I was looking at the chat like from around everywhere, basically. It's pretty impressive. All right, so the metaverse. This is a surreal moment for me, honestly, because I am somebody who I've worked in the tech industry for some time and had a particular passion point or interest in what is now being called the metaverse for several years. Going back to my first year at WSU, I worked with the McCormick Foundation for a funded conference on the early days of sort of the cultures, communities, and opportunities within virtual spaces. And so at that time, a lot of people scratched their head. What is this? I don't quite get it. Second Life was in the media at the time, so that was giving a little bit of a hint of that space. But there was just a lot of more of curiosity about it than sort of people taking it seriously. So it's kind of interesting how these things work, and that, you know, a decade plus later, we see this sort of hitting the hype cycle again. And so one thing I want to say before I get going here is I view my perspective on this as a little bit more sober and realistic, having been entrenched and dealing with these communities for over a decade. And so I really frankly will not be shy about saying where I think it is not a good fit, because I've seen as many failures as I have successes in this space. And obviously with looking at the lens in terms of marketing and or public relations opportunities as well. So with that said, and that perspective, we'll just jump right in here and talk about it. So first of all, just sort of acknowledging the fact that the term, the metaverse itself, is an area that I think a lot of confusion exists around that. Like, what is the definition of a metaverse? And I think in some ways that term gets thrown around a little bit too loosely, especially right now, to sort of be a catch-all to sort of perhaps describe more than, depending on who you ask, people might define it differently. So, just to sort of capture the essence of it and sort of the debate and the conversation, I just put on the screen here, and you can of course read it for yourself, that a couple of common definitions that are being used, whether it be the Oxford's dictionary's sort of classic dictionary definition, which is a virtual reality space in which users can interact with a computer-generated environment and other users. That's pretty generic, but that captures it to some degree. And then we see JP Morgan, which by the way, just issued an amazing, very in-depth report on virtual worlds, metaverses, and virtual economies, which we'll link to here momentarily. They have a definition, which is a little bit different, which is a seamless convergence of our physical and digital lives, creating a unified virtual community where we can work, play, relax, transact, and socialize. And then Mark Zuckerberg, with the Meta rebrand, kind of has his own take of it, and on and on and on. Again, who you ask, the definition may be a little bit differently. The one thing I want to say about this, and we'll kind of go through the landscape of what's out there that's being sort of labeled as platforms within the metaverse, is that I want to just say right from the get-go, be careful. Obviously your curiosity got you here, so I would assume there's at least some interest in it if you're in this presentation. But I also want to just sort of, again, have a realistic, sort of non-hype driven take on this, because it is not for everyone. There will be people in this organization that are skeptics, as they should be. There'll be people that are very enthusiastic, as they also should be, I guess. And there'll be people that might want to be convinced, is this right for my organization? So hopefully today we'll illuminate a little bit on whether it's a good fit for your organization or not. But beware of the hype. I have to say again, 10, 15 years ago, early days Second Life hype and virtual worlds first wave of interest, there was a lot of enthusiasm and also a lot of disappointment at that time as well. But again, question is it right for your specific organization? So just to sort of answer that question first, why? Why would this even be something that you would consider? for you or as an individual or for your organization, whether it be a utilitarian use for it, because you can certainly use virtual worlds in that in a very useful way, or is it something that's a PR or marketing or campaign related context? And so again, it may not be right for you or your organization. The one thing I want to say though is that a lot of times when we look at what the successes have been in a campaign consumer context, it's been when we look at virtual worlds and the metaverse platforms as something that optimizes for experiential marketing, which I know most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. And the idea that you can have an experience where people can engage with the brand and around the brand, maybe build up and strengthen their loyalty to the brand in something that adds value for them in an experiential way. And so the fact that you can immerse people in a 3D environment surrounded by content and communities where your brand is at the center of the conversation, but not in a hard sell, hit you over the head way, might be something where it fits quite well. And so we'll look at a case study or two where I think that that's happening right now in a very, very impactful way. So for people that participate in these existing communities, and then they see a brand or an entity come into them where there is value for them or provides a safe space for them to connect, perhaps surrounded around your brand or its messaging, that can be very powerful. Again, we'll look at an example or two of that where I think it works really, really well. The other thing I want to say that's very unique to many of these platforms is that they do establish for many community members a strong sense of collective, like a telepresence, where essentially, we're used to using Zoom now in this sort of pandemic era that's become mainstream, but that's in a very flat way. The video obviously communicates something that is effective in a certain context, but people get Zoom fatigue. I don't know about you, but my world got turned upside down when suddenly my workday went from face-to-face meetings to Zoom meetings back to back to back. And there's just something exhausting about that for many of us. In fact, there's been studies on that topic specifically. And sort of where a virtual world or one of these platforms comes into play that might be different is that sort of immersion element of it, that I might physically feel a sense of presence adjacent to and in a shared space that might not be captured the same way in a Zoom-like environment. And so that's been one of the sort of magic aspects of many of these virtual worlds. Again, there's several of them that are out there right now. And in these, as you know, if you've experienced these, you can communicate often with voice, as we do on Zoom. Rarely is video used in it. There are some platforms that allow you to have like bubbles with your face and video in them. So I don't want to say 100% video is not part of these environments, but usually it is voice and usually a combination of voice and text. And interestingly enough, in terms of cultural norms, in many of these virtual platforms, there's circumstances in which voice is used or on versus people prefer to communicate in text. There's different variables as to why one might be preferred over the other. But it's interesting to note that it's not always a given that voice is the preferred format of communication in these spaces. The other thing too, just to sort of answer the issue of the question of why, is that the power of these spaces, when you look at it in a positive context, is that many of the participants in these spaces, they have worked very strongly to craft their identities, their avatar, their presentation visually. That's not the case always, but for many people that participate in them, the identity that they craft, and it may or may not match their physical world attributes, is something that's done very deliberately and very much with care. And in some cases, not always, some of these platforms, folks actually sort of view their avatar as an extension of themselves and their identity, rather than an other or a playable character, if you will. It actually matches or maps out to their optimized selves. So a lot of variations on that, but just worth noting when you think about who the audiences are in many of these spaces. And then lastly here, in terms of the why, it does have the capacity to reach a very large, either synchronous in real time or asynchronous, not necessarily in real time audience. You can craft or create a branded space or a meeting space for your organization. Of course, people can meet up in real time there, and that can be very useful. But it's also worth noting that many of the campaigns and the efforts in these spaces are not about real time one and done events. It may be about creating a presence where people can pop in 24/7 to engage with your brand or your organization. And it doesn't necessarily require a social component, meaning others are there at the same time. And again, we see examples of that, as many examples as that exist for real-time event-based or one, all at the same time synchronous experiences. There are just as many examples of campaigns and organizations that don't aim for that. So there's a lot of different reasons why and how you would implement this. A quick reality check. Hype cycles come, they go up and they go down. And so I really want to, again, be honest and realistic because I really, that's the way to look at this. And note that what we've seen happen in terms of the quote unquote metaverse is a really insane spike in interest that is really much driven by the late 2021 announcement, understandably, when Facebook, being as large and influential as it is, makes this large bet to not only enter in as aggressively as they have with virtual worlds, but to also rebrand the company, to sort of just put that out there at that level to Meta. That got people talking, understandably. And so it entered into the pop culture vernacular, and people's interest in it spiked. And in fact, what we see here is just a simple Google Trends search that shows you over time where that spike came out in terms of queries or activity for the term metaverse. And then what happened is, of course, predictably, you see it sort of level off. And if we were to look at, say, this month or right now, it is significantly less. It's definitely not before the Meta branding announcement, but I would say that we've gone down in terms of search or consumer queries and interest on the internet, at least via Google, to almost about 1/4 of the activity. And also, of course, media cycles and stories and so forth have also leveled off a little bit. There's still a lot of conversation involving and around the future of the metaverse. There is still a lot of opportunity there, but let's just be honest and say that the spike really was driven in the current cycle a lot by the Meta announcement in terms of what we see going on the internet. I want to call your attention to, and you'll see in the resources for this presentation, a really valuable report that was just issued, I think 3, maybe 4 weeks ago by JP Morgan. And I'm going to actually grab the link to this. 1 second. Just going to cycle over here. You should see on my screen share what this actually looks like. I'm going to put it in local chat as well, so you can grab this for yourself. It's free and available for the masses on the internet from JP Morgan. Highly recommend you check this out for a really current snapshot on the state of the metaverse and the opportunities in the metaverse. And this really does not take a marketing specific approach to its report, but it does look at sort of the lay of the land. Who are the major players? What are the opportunities for businesses? There's a lot of current and relevant statistics that are there. It also does a good job of providing a primer for understanding this sector a little bit better. So that's just a resource to check out. And I'll point out that it's just a sliver of the highlights from that report, is that it does, I think, a pretty decent job of sort of breaking out the terminology that's being used, in some cases misused, out in the media. And they break it out in a paradigm of sort of looking at what they call Web 2.0 versus Web 3.0, which we're evolving the conversation here beyond just metaverse, by the way. When they say Web 3.0, that doesn't necessarily map perfectly to what a metaverse is. And in fact, that's where some of the confusion comes in sort of defining, well, what does this mean and what does that mean? They present Web 2.0 as the characteristics of it being more centralized versus the Web 3.0 as more decentralized. They look at platforms that are on Web 2.0 as having more of a traditional payment structure driving the virtual economies. And in fact, many of the economic models are specific to a unique platform. So a token or a unit of currency would stay within that gaming platform or that social platform versus being sort of ubiquitous or translatable to multiple ones. In Web 3.0, if you look at the JP Morgan profile, it kind of speaks a little bit more to the crypto and blockchain-based economies that are starting to pop up, and the idea that there's some transportability in some cases, or at least an aspiration for that as these platforms continue to evolve. And then, of course, critically, for those that are following the NFT phenomena, we see a pretty bold embrace of that amongst many of these platforms, whereas you don't necessarily see that across the board, if at all, in many of the Web 2.0 platforms. a great resource that breaks that out better, again, is in that report. What I want to do now is share a little bit in more detail about the lay of the land of the platforms. This is absolutely overwhelming for a lot of folks as they're starting to get up to speed on this space, because there are simply so many competing platforms that are out there that are not all the same. They are very, very different in their characteristics. And so just a quick understanding of what's out there. I would recommend, there's a site, I'll put this in chat, called Metaverse. It's Metaverse with a D at the end. Just type this in real quick. Great resource. It's a website that has a blog and they actually have a consultancy business as well, where they sort of break down the various competitors in this space and the ongoings of it. So that's a great resource for everyone. I've pulled from the metaverse.com, so full credit to the team over there, their infographic, and they've basically broken out the sector for the metaverse into essentially 4 different areas. And again, some might take issue with whether it should be defined this way or not. But what I want to point out is the sort of areas in which they define what the metaverse is. And after we get through this, then I'll start talking about specifics to campaigns and PR opportunities as well. So they basically look at one of the 4 sectors as being those that are either downloadable or browser-based experiences. So that means I would either navigate on the web to then engage within my browser, or maybe download a dedicated platform, or even in some cases a mobile app or a console-based entry point to the experience or to this particular platform. And so within that domain, they then further break it out. And you can see this in the graphic that we have here, where the age range for the participants there. And you can see that in this sector, you see sort of in the graphic, the bubbles in dark orange represent the different platforms. And the larger the bubble, of course, the larger the size in terms of its current user base. And so if you want to get a feel for who the big players are in this space, and particularly within this niche, this would kind of tell you that at a glance. So we see the very household name related, often gamified platforms like Minecraft and Roblox, which I'm sure many folks have kids that you can't get away from Roblox if you have kids. And then some of the other ones that are known as well. Again, a commonality for many of these is that there's usually, but not always, a gamified component to some of the larger, more well-known ones that also are driven by, in many cases, in some cases, creator-based economies as well, where creators can get in on the action and build as well. So just want to acknowledge that really the biggest piece of the pie right now today, when we talk about this sort of ecosystem of metaverses, and again, I use the term metaverses loosely because they're debating people that would take issue with the use of that term for these types of platforms. But in the metaverse.com analysis, they do include them in that definition. And so we see the common names here. And this right now, today, if you were just simply looking to reach the largest audience with the closest characteristics to a mainstream audience, you probably would look at one of these downloadable or browser-based established properties that are here. Where you see the yellow, there's a few of these small yellow dots that are in here. Those are announced and funded, but not yet launched players. So you can get a sense of most of the platforms that are out here are already out there into the common market. That won't be the case as we look at a few of the other areas that are in here. The second of the 4, coming from metaverse.com to again get the roadmap of who's out there, is those virtual reality or headset VR-based virtual worlds. And that's to say that these primarily have at their core of their function and access a VR component. There are some nuances to that, meaning that some of these are also accessible on desktop or non-VR, but VR is very core to their audience base or their strategy in terms of how they aim to grow. And the mammoth-sized player in the space is the one that that's driven this conversation lately. And that's, of course, Facebook/Meta. They're the ones that have an objective to sell these physical hardware headsets that they're trying to get out into the mainstream. And they've launched relatively successfully with those, but there still is a long way to go before those become either semi or full-on ubiquitous. And there's a lot of debate about whether they ever will be. But needless to say, Facebook is betting hard on this aspect of the metaverse so that they can sell these units out there. And not everybody wants to wear a VR headset. I'm sure there are many people here who have experienced and had a bad experience, and others that are high on the idea of VR. So it's a very polarizing type of thing for many people. But with that said, that's something to think about. Is a VR-like experience important for me and my organization? And it may not be. So you might want to look at platforms that do not have a VR component. The only other player I would argue right now that has any sort of market traction in a VR-based platform is probably VR chat. And before Meta kind of came in and has started to muscle its way in with its budgets and so forth, the VR chat platform had a pretty modest, successful reach of about 4 million active users. I think over time, that chart that we just looked at is going to change dramatically, and we're going to see the Meta get much, much larger. Of course, with the money, the muscle, and the might of Facebook or Meta, you're going to see a lot of action there, assuming they stay with it. The third of the four is entering into now the blockchain. And this is sort of the more sort of newer generation of these platforms that have come in. And in this case, we see those that are not primarily VR based. It is just, again, those that are downloadable or in a browser or in some cases a mobile app. And in this, the key defining component is the fact that they have some sort of economic model that's tied to the blockchain, whether it be Ethereum, which is one of the dominant ones, or a non-Ethereum based platform. And what I want to point out here, and this is just to think about the lay of the land, is that if you look at this graphic here from Metaverse, look how many yellow dots as opposed to orange there are. This is an area of great opportunity and growth, but not yet fully proven. So that's to say that there are many, many, many in development that have been announced and funded, but they haven't yet seen the light of day. And also look at the size of the dots that are here as well. And you'll notice that of those that are orange, meaning that they've launched already, such as the Sandbox and Decentraland and Axie Infinity, that they are still smaller in terms of their reach and size and user base compared to what we saw at the very beginning. There's no comparison right now to the Robloxes of the world and so forth. They're different kinds of platforms, they have different kinds of audiences, and frankly, there's different barriers to entry on these. And I don't want to say it sound like a naysayer, that's certainly not the message I'm trying to send, but I do want to say for context that, you know, again, if you're somebody who's on the fence about where I should invest my time or energy personally or for my professional organization, you want to kind of be aware of what you're getting into in terms of what the characteristics are and the opportunities are. And right now, there's a lot of promise in these platforms and the blockchain, but there's also a lot of peril. And many, many people, a lot of naysayers on some of these, and we're still waiting to see in the future the long-term viability of some of these economies and opportunities that are there. But there is a lot of experimentation, including by major brands in some of these platforms, notably Decentraland and the Sandbox are two that definitely stand out in terms of consumer campaign experiments. We'll look at one or two in a moment. Finally and last, and I would actually say least, frankly, I would put that judgment on it, and that is the blockchain and VR virtual worlds. And these are high barrier to entry because not only do you expect that a user who would engage in these platforms understand and go through the hurdles to engage with their crypto wallets and and understand blockchain if that's what they want to do, they also have to have one of these headsets. And so this means that there's only a little bit of activity where we see these newer platforms that both have at the center of their operations the VR component and the blockchain. Don't want to dismiss it, just acknowledging there really are no breakout successes yet at a great level in this sector. There are a couple that are breaking out of the pack that are noted here, but you'll see a lot of yellow here, meaning there's a lot in development, but not so much out there in the market just yet. And again, that would be something to think about if you're trying to reach it. This graphic, there's no way I'm going to define this entire graphic here because there's just not time to do so. But I do want to say to you that this graphic aims to show you really at a glance, at a high level, the sort of intertangled ecosystem of the metaverse and all of the related industries, not just the platforms that are now in play in this space. And there are some familiar names in here, certainly, including established tech companies that are putting their claim into this space. But there's an awful lot of scrappy startups here as well, and an awful lot of money being invested in it. And so this map kind of aims to capture the different elements or components within the overall metaverse ecosystem. The takeaway here is simply that there's a lot going on right now, a lot of promise and hope for the future as a viable business that goes beyond one or two platforms. And there's a lot of periphery companies and opportunities that are in here as well. And so just gives you at a glance a kind of feel for what's there. Quick nod and acknowledgement to the origins of a lot of what we're seeing right now, back to the OG, as they say, of virtual worlds, which is Second Life. Probably many of you have heard of that and probably think of it in a past tense. It is actually 19 years old this year. It'll have its 20th year of operations next year. And so that's an awful long time for any platform of this form to not only still be around and profitable, but still have an active audience user base. It's modest. It's about 1 million active users at any given time, over 70 million registered users in the long term. And it does have an active economy. So it's still a player out there, but it's just not grabbing the headlines it once did. And so notably not on the blockchain. Why I brought it up here, besides just a historical nod to it, is to acknowledge the fact that it is the pioneer on what are many of the attempts to do marketing in the metaverse. And so in all candidness, looking at what's worked and not worked, if we were to go back in time 15, 17, 19 years back to the earliest days of Second Life, when it did get headlines in its first wave, there were a lot of big brands just kind of dipping their toe in the metaverse, what we now call the metaverse, to kind of explore what this would look like. And with mixed results, candidly. We saw Coca-Cola and American Apparel and Nissan and, really quite a few brands go into the earliest experiments of virtual worlds, in this case, Second Life. And, the thing with this is that they were not all successes. So for example, American Apparel, as a fashion retailer, opened up a virtual 3D store where people could go in and shop, I guess, through the virtual spaces and purchase virtual goods for it. That closed down within, I think it was within several months, under a year after its operations. They did get headlines, and we see this with the current cycle as well, where there's a lot of like press release oriented announcements, and then there's like a ghost town afterwards, right? Where the actual visitors and influence at that point is, after the headlines sort of fade, is there. And that was kind of the case in some of the earliest experiments with Second Life. And in some cases, it was also driven by the way that they implemented their presence in these spaces. I'm going to come back to that topic because when we think about this current wave of interest, there are some lessons from that first wave of Second Life and other brands, and things that are actually working that are different from what that first wave of experimentation put out there. So let's talk about what works in the current wave and things to think about if this is the right fit for you. So first of all, I want to reemphasize the fact that sort of thinking about metaverse plays for your organization in an experiential marketing context. And that is to say, the last thing you should do if you're trying to experiment with these spaces is put something like a virtual billboard up, right? Where it's just like the logo and just plaster it somewhere. Like, sure, there may be some exposure opportunities there, and those do exist. But I think in terms of using these platforms in the most effective way, and again, we'll look at some case studies here in a moment, it's those that provide true value for the existing and potential communities that really reside or dwell or cater to those that are in these spaces. So that means understanding the cultures and the unique dynamics of the needs of those community members within those spaces. And the community members from one platform to the next may have different cultural dynamics. And so it's really understanding the characteristics of that particular platform that you're looking for. Do not do hard sells. I think that's to be accepted and have authenticity in these communities means you need to understand and demonstrate understanding in the way that you implement and engage with these communities. So again, an example we'll look at in a minute is one that builds a plan to have engagement and have something that immerses people and involves them and excites them. And it doesn't feel like you're being sold to. Not surprisingly, something that provides value will be received better than something that doesn't. So you really want to leverage the strengths of these platforms they're out there. I mentioned earlier this concept of telepresence, the idea of feeling that you're in the same room or same space as somebody else. And that's really one of the magic elements of these 3D platforms that are out there, that I can be, unlike Zoom where it feels flat, I can feel proximity wise like I'm actually in that same space. And you can leverage and play on that sort of phenomena in the way that some of these campaigns and communities are built within these spaces. And I also want to emphasize that unlike Zoom and some of these other distant connection platforms that we engage with professionally, is that virtual worlds and metaverse type platforms are also particularly strong when you acknowledge that there's a characteristic to how we use them, which actually can make us amplify aspects of our personality in a playful and fun way. Not always the right fit. If you're in an organization that's more of a button-up organization where that may not be welcomed in the culture of your company, if you're using this in that capacity, that might not be the right fit. So you want to think about who it is you're trying to reach and what you're trying to accomplish. And do you want that individualistic playfulness to come out, or is it appropriate, in the way that you're engaging either with your customers or your colleagues? So that's something to think about. Some organizations love the fact that you can sort of have playfulness, and others would not welcome that at all. Don't launch and leave. Work with the top creators that are out there in that community wherever possible. Collaborate. Recognize that there's an external social media component that can help you amplify beyond these platforms, so that there's reach and understanding that goes beyond just the communities within them as well. I'm going to move a little bit faster here because I'm looking at time and I want to make sure I get to these examples. So here's one of the examples that I really, really like, and that is Vans. And that's they've done a collaboration with Roblox. So Roblox, of course, a massive platform. This is the epitome of a great experiential marketing effort. Participants here, they knew their audience, and so they actually created value. They created an environment where the brand was there, but it wasn't slapping you in the face with, buy, buy, buy. And so you can engage. They had free goodies that people could get. They had challenges that folks can engage with. I encourage you to Google or check that out if you want to look at it. There's plenty of videos and things that show you a little bit more about it on the web. That's just a great example. Another example from one of these blockchain ones is where you see an entertainment property in there. In this case, you see Snoop Dogg, a musician, a rapper, into partnering with the Sandbox, one of these blockchain-based worlds, that the newer generation that are out there. And so they did like an early access pass. They did NFTs where you could actually purchase, and then those purchases, and so they did monetize these experiences. They actually tried to build a sense of community around inclusiveness and sort of the VIP aspect of being part of the brand, an insider, if you will. And so there's a lot of things there, and aspects of what defined this particular promotion is that they really played on the idea of scarcity. There's only so many, or a fear of missing out. So, be a part of this and be close to your favorite brand, or in this case, entertainer, by being an insider. And in this case, you had to actually purchase a pass to do so. So it wasn't for everybody in that regard, but it did get you an opportunity to be part of an insider and feel connected by that investment. And then, of course, there would be exclusive access to things as a result of that. I'm going to move on just for time reasons, but another big one was an event that was just held a couple of weeks ago called Metaverse Fashion Week. It was a collaboration of several companies together. There was a real world designer who at New York Fashion Week launched, before the physical fashion show, the day before, a virtual equivalent of it. There was a runway show. You can see the video of it here right now. There were virtual goods and NFT versions as well that were made available. And at that point, the next day, you could actually go and see the physical runway, and then the fashions were released to the physical world. So it was really bridging the gap between the two and extending the brand and awareness of the designer and its goods into the virtual spaces. And that was one that got a lot of media attention. And so that's a great example. And one of the virtual NFTs sold for, I think it was $2,800 US. So it just kind of gives you a sense of context of that there's actually some interesting things going on economically in these brand collaborations with NFTs. Another example, I'm just going to throw this one out fast, is use of video and multimedia in these virtual spaces. You can have like virtual cinemas and things of that nature, and screenings, and put PowerPoints up and all those interactive things in a 3D space in a shared environment. And when the pandemic was shutting everything down, some brands turned to the virtual worlds. The cable network Adult Swim did a great example where they did a world premiere screening in a virtual environment with the creators and producers and talent with their fans in a virtual cinema branded environment to that show. It's called The Shivering Truth. And they had free swag that attendees could get and all of that. It was just a great event, got a lot of media coverage. They even did in-world interviews with the cast. They invented the media as a preview for this event. They took, in avatar form, the creators would be interviewed by the reporters, also in avatar form. We see a video of this happening right here. And they did the voice-based interviews with their avatar forms. And then that video then would be part of the media coverage. In this case, I think we're looking at Collider, at collider.com was this particular one. There were 2 or 3 in-world, if you will, media interviews that were done as a lead up to promote this particular community event. Moving beyond consumer brands, just because I know many of you are probably going to be very interested in non-campaign based uses, I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of organizations, perhaps yours, that might want to use these in more of a utilitarian way. Maybe not so much a campaign as it is just a meeting opportunity that adds a little fun to people getting together remotely. You have a team that's distributed, et cetera. And so there are town halls and meetups that happen regularly in many of these platforms where you can basically get your avatars together and again, have that sense of shared space. So, I mean, I've worked in situations where I have teams that are around the world. And so, and I've had situations where we've done exactly this. We've all come together. You know, we can do a Zoom call, sure, and we do. But we also sometimes will, and it's appropriate for that organization and the personality of the personnel, but we will also meet in these platforms. And it's just a fun, different way to connect and sort of break the ice, you know, as you're getting to know your teammates. And in some cases, you can do work very efficiently and hold meetings there as well. A great example I want to call out is eXp Realty. If you're familiar with one of the large, more virtual real estate firms, they have agents around, you know, all the US. They have 75,000 different employees that, as part of the organization, use one of these virtual platforms. In fact, they bought the platform. It's called Verbella, and so that same company owns the platform that they use. It's called Verbella, and they use it for these virtual meeting environments. So employees log in from around the world, you know, as the real estate agents, and then they meet in these spaces, sometimes breakout teams and all hands and things of that nature. And so there's a lot of that happening. I think more so than people realize, there are organizations that are going all in, like eXp Realty is probably an extreme example of such, but there are companies doing it at that level. Doesn't mean they want to use it for PR or marketing campaigns. They just want to use it functionality wise within their organizations to sort of break out beyond Zoom. Oops, let me go back one. Here we go. Acknowledging the fact that educators, I mean, I'm obviously at WSU, Washington State University, and so we've done a lot of experiments in virtual spaces. And so I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of education uses for these as well. Nonprofits, healthcare, the same thing. Great example that we're showcasing is that a lot of charities and nonprofits are using virtual worlds and metaverse platforms. There's a lot of experimentation going on right now. And just be aware of the fact that that's happening. The one I love to showcase is the American Cancer Society with their Relay for Life campaign. They've raised over $4 million US dollars over the last decade or so. It's one of the very successful partners. In this case, it's a Second Life example, but there are many other platforms as well with their various campaigns. And so that's very impactful for them. And the nuance to that is that they involve the community. And there are community teams for Relay for Life. If you're familiar with it, they do those within the virtual spaces as well. And then everybody gets together for the common cause of raising funds for that particular entity. Just want to acknowledge that outside of virtual worlds, you want to make sure your efforts are not just seen enclosed within the boundaries of that space. So there is a whole secondary phenomena going on of virtual influencers that amplify and extend the reach of these campaigns out into standard social media platforms. So we have actually virtual influencers. They're actually avatar-based personalities that have their own Instagram and social media followers, and they do product deals. There's actually a whole agency that's dedicated to driving these types of deals. And so that's something just to be aware of. That's actually pretty interesting that's going on. Lil McKellar was featured there. Metaverse streamers are a big thing. I'm sure everybody here knows Twitch and YouTube and all of that. And so the idea that you can extend what's going on in Metaverse and your space into these social platforms, that's really a critical ingredient for success. Getting to the last ones, because I think we're at the point we're going to take questions and we can go back on anything as people have weigh in on questions. But I want to come back to the point that I'm not here to sell the idea that you should or should not do a metaverse. And in fact, there are many challenges for these spaces. It absolutely is not the right fit for many organizations. For all the reasons we've discussed that are good, there are just as many bad points as well. And so many companies, by their own admission, will say these are experimental efforts right now. Many are capitalizing on the sort of press release driven announcements where it's a one and done situation. That may not be the right fit. That's only going to last so long. In fact, as we saw with the Google Trends search, you sort of had the peak already. So, if that's your goal to just get a one hit, in a press release, that's probably not the right motivation to do these kinds of things. You really need to make an investment for a longer term play and experiential marketing perspective. Also, the development costs to build and the skill sets needed to do it are out of grasp for a lot of smaller organizations, admittedly. You want to think about your audience, and this is just the right fit for them. And then lastly, the scaling of concurrency. So if you're looking to do a mass scale, all at once type event, please recognize that many of these platforms are not, by their nature, very good at scaling. So if you want 1 million simultaneous users for a big pop on an event, it's not technically impossible on some platforms. There's something technically called instancing, but beyond the scope of today. But for most experiences that you would build, you would not see a scale at that size easily or at all. And so just be aware that you want to think about more of an intimate nature if it is a real-time simultaneous thing. So to wrap up, what can you do to get started? I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of resources we're going to share with you, and this in the next slide. You can click and see and follow up on those resources to learn more on getting started. Also acknowledging that there's actually pop-up dedicated firms. Some are specifically geared at the metaverse and virtual worlds, and others are creating units of them as well within their established organizations. So there is talent starting to go out there into the marketplace to help you jumpstart your space or your play into these spaces. But please take a look. There's an Ad Week and Ad Age resource here. And then I'll just close on this last slide, which is some wonderful resources. Again, I follow this sector pretty closely, and I would say if I was looking at just a handful of key things, that these are them. There's some great podcasts that are out there that maybe can educate you quickly on it. I mentioned the Metaverse and JP Morgan papers and blogs that are out there. And then there's quite a few others as well. So these will be, if you don't have them, you'll probably get them on follow-up, but these are wonderful resources to check out as well. And with that said, I think I've hit my mark on time. So I guess we can look at questions. I'll turn it to you, Mike.
All right, Brett. Hey, first off, just to reiterate, you're talking to folks from around Washington and 11 other states. So you have people representing 25% of the states in our union with you here today.
Wow.
And the first question is from Julius. Julius wants to know what branding opportunities arise in the metaverse for brands.
Yeah, well, there are quite a few, but I mean, again, is it the right fit is the first question I would ask. But in terms of opportunities specifically, so I mean, look at what's happening right now in this space. You're seeing a lot of experimentation. Again, I would characterize it as experimentation in these spaces. So an example would be, we saw, I think Miller Lite, the beer brand, they did a Super Bowl campaign. This is probably on the extreme of the spectrum, but they partnered with Decentraland. Not so much that Decentraland had millions of users. I think they realized that there was a unique opportunity to be associated with something cutting edge and experimental, and perhaps to their demographic, they felt that that was important. So that's on one extreme of the spectrum. On the other extreme of the spectrum, in terms of small businesses and so forth, that may not have that budget or the ambitions of that front, you see experimental, lower cost entries into some of these platforms. You know, in some cases, you can buy or rent virtual space where you then build out a small presence. Engaging and the marketing tactics to engage within these communities, that's almost a full-on second hour that we would need to get into. But these firms that are out there and these resources kind of break out more specifics on the successes of it. But yes, at a large scale or a small scale, these experiments are happening all over right now. And yes, there are some entrenched longer term community campaigns that have actually worked quite well. I think, again, looking at the Roblox example with Vans, I think is a great one that's been around for a few months now. That's actually doing quite well.
Fantastic. And we may have to schedule you for that second hour down the road. But for now, Brunella would like to know, what should B2B brands be doing at this time? And she adds, would you recommend just continuing to monitor the metaverse?
Yeah, that's a great question, because obviously I've focused to some degree a lot on the business to consumer side of it, which is perhaps different, right, than business to business. The one thing I would say from a business to business perspective is, you know, is it something where, is it a right fit for your audience and your customer base? You know, is it something where the demographic is going to be more leaning into these more, you know, edgy or different types of technologies, or are they going to be more button up? And if it's not, if it's on the more conservative side, I would definitely sit back and monitor and be careful, or take a utilitarian approach where you see that the use of the platform actually provides value in the way that you engage with, you know, from one company to another. There are a lot of enterprise uses. In fact, there are enterprise specific virtual world and metaverse platforms. That's their sole focus in the functionality of it. So for example, I'll just give one last example here, is that, using a shared space where people can get together and meet with their clients or other customers, that sort of thing, which allows you to do presentations like PowerPoints and video embeds, voice communication, scripted experiential parts of the experience. So like there's actually, I went through it quickly, but I really want to go back to the idea that with healthcare specifically, there's scripted simulations and education simulations where going in there, it's different than watching a video. You're actually in there clicking around and engaging and surrounded literally by these scripted experiences that educate you in a different way. So I would say if you're in a non-consumer based situation, look at the utility of these and look at the cost analysis and whether that's going to be the right fit to reach your goals.
Well, perfect. That's a good transition because Anita would like to mentions that nonprofits usually don't have the cash to invest in this. But if a mid-sized youth organization had a financial sponsor, might Metaverse be an option to engage young people?
Yes, and there's a lot of layers to this, but one situation is that many platforms specifically are cost conscious in terms of what the cost of entry is for those that want to develop within those platforms. And it can be everything from low to no cost. If you are willing yourself to get the tools, you can literally do it yourself. Others charge money for the virtual space or virtual real estate, as they say. And those costs can be anything from very, very low to very, very high, depending on what your reach and size and placement is within those virtual spaces. So if you do not have a lot of money, there are a lot of nonprofits. And by the way, I will say that in addition to that, there are many educational or nonprofit discounts offered by many of these platforms where the general consumer market might pay something different for a placement within these spaces. You do not need to have necessarily a lot of money, I will say that, on these platforms, but you will need the skills in order to understand and how to build and get that launched. So it is not necessarily tethered to a big budget.
Fantastic. Ahmed has one that he says, how can you use the pay? And I believe we're talking, he uses an example about cryptocurrency later on, to earn functionality of blockchain to create economics and incentivize engagement with a brand. And again, his example is brand X buys some crypto, then creates a unique token that is only possible to earn as part of their campaign, but it can be used outside of the engagement with the campaign. Or is that a hard sell?
Yeah, I'm going to try to succinctly answer that. I think it's a more complex answer, honestly. But what I will say is, first of all, a danger sign or a red flag here, which is to say that really, if you're going to monetize or have a token-based connectedness to your campaign, I mean, if you're talking in the context of a marketing or a campaign or a brand affiliation or an organization affiliation, I just want to put that red flag out there that there's a lot of risk. I mean, I'll just be honest, I'm going to editorialize here. For me personally, I have some nervousness about this part of the phenomena that's happening right now. I don't want to dismiss those that are fans of it, but the reality is there's a lot of Silicon Valley snake oil salesmen in this space. I just said that. It's almost like a tongue twister there. But there really are. There's a lot of fraud, money laundering risks. I mean, there's a lot of problems in this space. I'm not trying to discount the value of it either. So you really do need to be careful when you engage. And if you connect your brand to these spaces, really making sure that you connect with a credible platform that does it the right way. And also, how's your customer base going to react and what are they trying to achieve? Are you trying to engage them in a way that they can make money with you? Is it that you're trying to make money from them? So this is why I say it's kind of a nuanced response, because there's a lot of layers to this and a lot of red flags on how you do that. I don't know if that's adequately answering the question, but what I would say is there's a lot of cautionary tales of how to do this sort of engagement. And I will say this last comment is, not all communities and these platforms are welcoming of being monetized. They are very savvy and concerned. Not everybody wants an NFT component, for example, or a blockchain component. Some do, but there have been many examples of brands or communities that have have had NFTs introduced or a monetization component introduced to them, and they've been very vocal about their dissatisfaction with that. The gaming platforms that have tried to monetize, some of the brands that have tried to ride the wave of NFTs have gotten very big snark responses on their social media when they thought they were going to get an enthusiastic response. So again, I just want to put that out there that you really need to know why you're doing that and what your goals are. And when you start bringing money in the equation, it's a whole different game.
Great, great. Innovative question by Ahmed. Thank you. Amy and I actually share the same question, Brett. I had this written down as well. Have you seen any government organizations participating in the metaverse and any innovation going on from government?
Yeah, and interestingly enough, this goes back to the old school slide of Second Life, 15, 20 years ago, whatever. There were actually government organizations way back, a decade plus ago in the first wave. And by the way, some of them have stayed over the last decade. They've never left. So the answer is yes, there are examples. I mean, I think back to embassies in virtual spaces, which are happening yet again in this current wave. In the first wave, I think it was Estonia, was like, they did a press release, of course, right? They first, I don't know, ambassador or whatever, presence inside of space. But there are also government entities. I've seen city organizations that have used it for the virtual meeting capacities of these spaces. There's been public works campaigns that have done there, a lot of healthcare campaigns. We've seen government entities like NASA, the IRS, believe it or not, had a virtual presence at one point. In the current wave in Decentraland and the Sandbox, there's some explorations that are going on there in terms of embassies and so forth. So yeah, the short answer is yes. Sometimes it's for the promotional wow of it. Other times it's actually for the functionality of the meeting space piece of the platforms.
Very cool. Well, I think at this time of year, many of us might be more interested in checking out the NASA site than the IRS site.
Yeah.
I appreciate that answer. We have no more in the chat, but I've got one I'd like to ask you. What should be created for the metaverse, in your opinion, that you haven't seen yet? What's not there?
Well, that's a great question. What should be there? The one thing I will say, I'm going to stop screen sharing here just so we have a full screen here back. But what I will say is I believe that, as I said earlier, experiential opportunities that provide value and take into consideration the unique characteristics and customs of those communities are those that are going to be most impactful if it is a campaign in that nature. I've seen so many failures where a company comes in and they just think that they can slap their brand, in a virtual environment, and then it gets rejected. And so then why did you do this? Like, why did you go to the trouble when you didn't even take care to understand your audience? Just like you would for a non-virtual or non-metaverse related campaign. You can't be sloppy about it. You need to know who your audience is. And I mean, I hate to call out so I won't say the name, but an early experiment that was a terrible failure was one where it was a fashion brand that came in and they wanted to make a quick buck, frankly, from one of these platforms. Right. And so they just basically slapped on a generic kind of offering their label, basically. And the product itself, the virtual good, believe it or not, there's quality issues of terms on all virtual goods are created equally. Mm-hmm. And so this one was sort of slapped together, and the people that understood that community realized it was a quickly, hastily, sloppily put together product. And so, yeah, it had that brand name that was well known, but it was rejected and mocked by the community members. So, you don't want to just try to do a quick, boom in and out that does not factor in the audience. And it's the same principles that apply to non-metaverse related campaigns. You just need to know your audiences.
This is a long-term campaign type of platform, it sounds like. Hey, we've got one more question that popped in. Actually, we've got two. I don't know if we'll have time for both, but the first one from Andrea: what problems have you seen with avatar imposters? As a researcher, we're seeing lots of this, fake lists of respondents.
One of the unique attributes that's actually is problematic. It's good and it's bad. It's a double-edged sword. Is the idea of anonymity within virtual spaces. So for many people, that's part of the appeal, because they can sort of, escape into these spaces, reinvent themselves in many cases, whether it be an optimized version of themselves or a totally different personality. There's a lot of research on that topic alone. The downside of this, to your point, is that anonymity invites problems where people have poor intentions. And so in terms of fraudulent behavior, trolling, and other problematic behavior, you do see a lot of that in these virtual spaces. And that's a governance issue specific to each platform. Meta or Facebook in their platform that's out there have been called out specifically on these problems recently, as they kind of have quickly launched into the space. And they've tried to take some public actions to sort of improve the protections for its user base. But there's a lot of debate about to what degree should we be required when we're in these 3D spaces to have our real world identities known or not. And I will tell you, some of the culture and the norms within not all, but many of these spaces are that we do not, that we have that it's actually a part of the value of not having to reveal your identity. So it is an issue. I don't know what to say about it, except that yes, there are imposters. There's also brand name problems where people's IP get lifted and sold, and there needs to be governance and DMCA requests for takedown on that as well. So yeah, there's a lot of problems that still are out there that have not fully been addressed, probably to everybody's likes, in terms of getting those problems solved. I think there's a lot of work to be done.
All right, I'm going to draw a line here. And for anyone else who has questions, Mary Dale and others, we have your email address and we'll ask Brett to address those offline. Right now, I'm going to hand it back to Andrea.
So again, just a huge applause to Brett. This was so informative and interesting. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you next time.